Welcome to Compassion Over Silence. I'm your host, Rashida Saunders. Today we're talking about love, not the kind we see in movies, not the kind we post about on social media. We're talking about the kind of love that asks us to be seen, the kind that requires vulnerability, the kind that challenges the stories we've carried about ourselves for years. This is a space for honest conversations about leadership, healing, identity, service, and what happens when strength and humanity exist together, because carrying it all quietly comes at a cost. For most of my life, I thought I understood why relationships were difficult. I thought I was afraid of being hurt, afraid of being disappointed, afraid of being abandoned. And while those fears were real, therapy eventually revealed something deeper. I wasn't just afraid of losing love, I was afraid of receiving it, not consciously, not intentionally, but somewhere along the way, I learned that closeness came with risk, that needing people created opportunities for disappointment, that depending on others was dangerous. So I became very good at taking care of myself, very good at handling things alone, very good at carrying my own burdens. The problem is that the skills that help us survive don't always help us connect. And sometimes the armor that protects us from pain also protects us from love. That's what I want to explore today. Not why relationships fail, but why healthy love can feel uncomfortable when you've spent years surviving. Why safety can feel unfamiliar, why consistency can feel suspicious, and why some of us spend years longing for connection while simultaneously protecting ourselves from it. Love, scarcity, and survival. Before I understood anything about attachment, vulnerability, or emotional safety, I understood survival. I understood responsibility. I understood adaptation. I understood how to read a room. I understood how to anticipate needs. I understood how to take care of myself. Looking back, I realized that many of the lessons I carried into adulthood had very little to do with love and everything to do with survival. Growing up, love wasn't always expressed through words. It wasn't always expressed through affection. There weren't a lot of hugs. There weren't long conversations about feelings. There wasn't a lot of reassurance. Again, I want to be clear, I was loved. But love and emotional safety are not always experienced the same way. In my childhood home, love was often expressed through responsibility, doing what needed to be done, helping where you could, carrying your weight, being resilient, being tough, being grateful, being quiet. And when you're a child, you don't question the environment you're raised in. You adapt to it. You learn the rules. You learn what gets attention. You learn what keeps you safe. You learn what is expected. One of the things I didn't understand until much later was how scarcity shapes the way people move through the world. When resources are limited, you learn to pay attention, you learn to calculate, you learn to prepare, you learn not to waste. And sometimes that mindset extends far beyond money. It extends into relationships, into trust, into love. Without realizing it, I learned to approach relationships the same way I approach survival, carefully, cautiously, always assessing risk, always preparing for disappointment, always making sure I could take care of myself if things went wrong. I learned to value independence because independence felt safe. I learned to rely on myself because relying on myself felt predictable. I learned to keep moving because slowing down felt vulnerable. At the time, those skills served me well. They helped me navigate challenges. They helped me build a career. They helped me become successful. They helped me survive. But survival and connection are not the same thing. The very skills that help us survive difficult environments can become barriers to intimacy later in life. Because intimacy asks us to do something survival never required. It asks us to trust. It asks us to receive. It asks us to depend on someone else. It asks us to believe that support will still be there tomorrow. And if you've spent years preparing for things to disappear, that's not always easy. I didn't realize how much of my life was being influenced by those early lessons. I thought I was being strong. I thought I was being wise. I thought I was protecting my peace. But often I was simply protecting my wounds. What I called independence was sometimes fear. What I called discernment was sometimes self protection. What I called strength was sometimes distance. And it would take years before I understood the difference. Because here's what nobody tells you: you can long for love and still be afraid of it. You can want connection and still resist it. You can desire intimacy and still push it away when it arrives. Not because there's something wrong with you, but because your nervous system learned survival long before it learned safety. And for a long time, I was trying to build healthy relationships with lessons that had been designed for survival. Eventually, life forced me to confront a difficult question. What if the thing I called independence wasn't freedom at all? What if it was fear wearing a very convincing disguise? One of the most surprising things I learned in therapy was that familiar and safe are not always the same thing. For years, I assumed they were. I assumed that if something felt uncomfortable, it must be wrong. I assumed that if something felt unfamiliar, it must be risky. But healing taught me something different. Sometimes danger feels familiar, and sometimes safety feels uncomfortable. Think about that for a moment. If you've spent years expecting people to leave, consistency can feel suspicious. If you've spent years handling everything yourself, support can feel uncomfortable. If you've spent years earning love through performance, unconditional love can feel confusing. If you've spent years believing that vulnerability creates opportunities for disappointment, intimacy can feel threatening. I know that feeling well. There were times when someone would offer help, and my first instinct was to decline. Not because I didn't need it, but because accepting it felt vulnerable. There were times when someone would ask me what I needed, and I genuinely didn't know how to answer. I had spent so many years focusing on everyone else's needs that I had lost touch with my own. There were times when someone showed me kindness, and I immediately wondered what they wanted in return, not because they had done anything wrong, but because I had learned to expect transactions. I had learned to expect conditions. I had learned to expect that everything came with a cost. What I didn't realize was that healthy relationships operate differently. Healthy relationships aren't constantly keeping score. Healthy relationships aren't built on perfection. Healthy relationships aren't sustained through performance. They're built on trust, honesty, consistency, and mutual care. But when you've spent years surviving, trust can feel far more dangerous than control. Control feels predictable. Control feels familiar. Control creates the illusion of safety. Trust requires surrender. Trust requires uncertainty. Trust requires the willingness to believe that someone will show up without guarantees. That's difficult when your life has taught you to rely primarily on yourself. And if I'm honest, there were times when I confused self sufficiency with strength. I wore independence like a badge of honor. I told myself I didn't need anyone. I told myself I was fine handling things on my own. I told myself that depending on other people only created opportunities for disappointment. But underneath all of that confidence was something much more vulnerable, a fear that if I truly let someone in, they might see parts of me I wasn't sure were lovable, the exhausted parts, the anxious parts, the grieving parts, the imperfect parts, the parts that weren't strong all the time, the parts that couldn't hold everything together. And that's when I began to realize that intimacy isn't just about allowing someone to know you, it's about allowing yourself to be known. And for someone who spent years surviving through self protection, that was one of the hardest lessons of all. The irony is that I didn't struggle most in unhealthy relationships. Unhealthy relationships made sense to me. Distance made sense. Inconsistency made sense. Uncertainty made sense. Emotional unavailability made sense. Those dynamics felt familiar. I knew how to navigate them. I knew how to survive them. The relationships that challenged me most were the healthy ones. The ones where someone genuinely cared. The ones where someone showed up consistently. The ones where someone wanted to know what I was feeling. The ones where someone wasn't trying to fix me, control me, or change me. The ones where someone simply wanted to be close. Because that's when the armor would show up. Not when I was being hurt, when I was being loved. I remember one relationship in particular. There was a man who saw me, not the officer, not the leader, not the person everyone depended on. Me. He would ask about my day and actually wait for the answer. He noticed when I got quiet. He paid attention to the things I didn't say. He was patient, consistent, present, and for reasons I couldn't fully understand at the time, that scared me. Not because he had done anything wrong, because he hadn't. The closer he got, the more uncomfortable I became. I started questioning things that didn't need to be questioned, analyzing things that didn't need to be analyzed, looking for signs that something was wrong, looking for evidence that he would eventually leave, looking for proof that my fears were justified. In hindsight, I wasn't protecting myself from him. I was protecting myself from vulnerability. I was protecting myself from hope. Because hope creates risk. Hope asks us to believe that something good might actually last. And if you've experienced enough disappointment, hope can feel dangerous. It's easier to prepare for loss than it is to trust in love. At least that's what I believed. So I did what many people do when intimacy feels uncomfortable. I created distance. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough. Enough to stay protected, enough to avoid feeling fully exposed, enough to maintain control. And that's the thing about fear. Fear rarely announces itself. It doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like overthinking. Sometimes it looks like self sufficiency. Sometimes it looks like independence. Sometimes it looks like finding reasons why something won't work. Sometimes it looks like keeping one foot out the door. At the time, I told myself I was being cautious. I told myself I was protecting my peace. I told myself I was being wise. But eventually, I had to confront a difficult truth. There is a difference between discernment and self protection. There is a difference between wisdom and fear. And there's a difference between choosing distance because someone is unsafe and choosing distance because intimacy feels unfamiliar. That realization changed everything. Because for the first time, I began asking a different question. What if the biggest obstacle to connection wasn't other people? What if the biggest obstacle was the armor I had spent years building around my own heart? Learning how to receive love. Recognizing the pattern was one thing, changing it was something else entirely. One of the hardest truths I've learned is that awareness doesn't automatically create transformation. You can understand your patterns intellectually and still struggle emotionally. You can know where your fears came from and still feel them. You can recognize your armor and still reach for it when you feel vulnerable. Healing doesn't happen because we understand ourselves. Healing happens because we practice something different over and over again. For me, that meant learning how to receive. And that sounds simple until you realize how uncomfortable receiving can be. Receiving help, receiving support, receiving kindness, receiving reassurance, receiving love. When you've spent years proving your worth through what you do, receiving can feel almost irresponsible. You feel like you should be contributing more, giving more, helping more, earning more. You feel like there should be a transaction somewhere, a way to balance the scales. But healthy love doesn't keep score. Healthy love isn't a negotiation. Healthy love doesn't require constant proof. That's what made it so difficult for me to trust. I knew how to give love. Giving felt safe. Giving allowed me to stay in control. Giving allowed me to be useful. Giving allowed me to feel needed. Receiving required something different. Receiving required trust. Receiving required vulnerability. Receiving required me to believe that I was worthy of care even when I wasn't performing, even when I wasn't solving problems, even when I wasn't helping someone else. That was a lesson my heart resisted for a long time because somewhere along the way I had connected love to achievement. I had connected worthiness to performance. I had connected belonging to usefulness. And those beliefs don't disappear overnight. They soften gradually, one experience at a time, one relationship at a time, one act of courage at a time. The older I get, the more I realize that love isn't something we earn. It's something we learn to receive. And for many of us, receiving love is far more difficult than giving it, because giving allows us to stay protected. Receiving asks us to be seen. Giving allows us to stay strong. Receiving asks us to be human. Giving allows us to maintain control. Receiving asks us to trust. And trust is difficult when you've spent years preparing for disappointment. But healing has taught me that trust isn't built through certainty, it's built through experience. One honest conversation at a time, one vulnerable moment at a time, one healthy relationship at a time, one decision to stay open when it would be easier to retreat, one decision to tell the truth when it would be easier to hide, one decision to let someone care for you when every instinct tells you to handle it alone. That's what I'm still learning, not how to love, how to receive it, how to believe that I don't have to earn it, how to believe that my worth exists independent of what I accomplish, how to believe that being human is enough. And maybe that's what healing ultimately is, not becoming stronger, not becoming more independent, not becoming more self sufficient, but becoming safe enough to let love in. These days, I understand something that my younger self didn't. Love was never the problem. Vulnerability was. Being known was. Being seen was. Allowing someone close enough to witness the parts of myself I worked so hard to hide was. For years, I thought courage looked like independence. I thought courage looked like handling everything on my own. I thought courage looked like never needing help, never needing reassurance, never needing support. But I've come to believe that real courage looks different. Real courage is telling the truth. Real courage is admitting what you need. Real courage is letting people matter. Real courage is staying present when every instinct tells you to run, because that's the thing about intimacy. There are no guarantees. There is no promise that you'll never be disappointed. No promise that you'll never experience loss. No promise that your heart will never be broken. To love is to accept risk. To care deeply is to accept uncertainty. To let people in is to acknowledge that they have the power to hurt you, but they also have the power to heal parts of you that cannot be healed alone. That's the part we don't talk about enough. Healing doesn't only happen in isolation. Healing happens in relationships. Healing happens when someone shows up consistently. Healing happens when someone listens without judgment. Healing happens when someone stays. Healing happens when someone reminds you, through their actions, that not everyone leaves, that not every disagreement becomes abandonment, that not every vulnerable moment becomes rejection, that not every relationship requires you to earn your place. I still catch myself reaching for the armor sometimes. I still catch myself wanting to handle everything alone. I still catch myself believing that strength means self sufficiency. But now I notice it. And because I notice it, I can choose differently. I can choose honesty. I can choose connection. I can choose trust. I can choose to let people support me instead of always being the one doing the supporting. I can choose to receive the same grace I so freely offer others. That has become part of my healing. Not eliminating fear, learning not to let fear lead. Because fear will always have something to say. Fear will tell you to stay guarded. Fear will tell you to stay distant. Fear will tell you to protect yourself at all costs. But healing asks a different question. What might be possible if love, instead of fear, got to lead? And maybe that's the invitation. Not perfection, not fearlessness, just a willingness to stay open, a willingness to trust again, a willingness to believe that what you've been longing for might actually be waiting on the other side of the armor you've worked so hard to maintain. As I reflect on my own journey, I realize that love was never the threat. Being seen was, being known was, allowing someone close enough to witness the parts of myself I spent years protecting was. But healing has taught me that the goal isn't to eliminate fear, it's to stop letting fear lead. Fear will always have something to say. It will tell us to stay guarded, stay distant, and stay in control. But love asks something different. Love asks us to stay open, to tell the truth, to let people matter, to trust that we don't have to earn what healthy relationships are willing to give freely. If you've ever struggled with intimacy, trust, or vulnerability, I want to leave you with this question. What if the thing you're protecting yourself from is the very thing you're longing for? What if love feels unsafe not because it's dangerous, but because it's unfamiliar? Maybe the next chapter of healing isn't about becoming stronger. Maybe you've already done enough surviving. Maybe the next chapter is about becoming more open, more honest, more willing to receive, and more willing to trust. Until next time, remember that you do not have to earn love through suffering. You do not have to prove your worth through performance, and you do not have to carry everything alone. If this conversation resonated with you, follow the podcast, leave a review, and share it with someone who may need it. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other. Leadership, humanity, honest conversations.